economics new members of CEPR. We already have a tightly knit small community here. We've been meeting since we started, and this week we will be meeting and listening to Isabela Manelici, who is at LSE and currently at Munich, visiting for the summer, and she's going to talk about responsible sourcing theory and evidence from Costa Rica. So the same format, 1 hour, including questions and discussion, and we can go beyond if there's interest. So take it away, Isabela.
Thank you so much. I hope you're now seeing my slides full screen. I appreciate everyone connecting despite the intense Zoom fatigue by now, and also alternatives involving caipirinhas or whatever else in July. So this is joint work with long-term collaborators Alonso Alfaro from the Central Bank of Costa Rica, and Jose Vasquez, who's also an assistant professor at the LSE. And on this project, Ben Faber and Cecile Gobert from UC Berkeley have joined us. And today we're going to talk about responsible sourcing. And we're going to have both an empirical take on what are the effects of responsible sourcing and also a theoretical based one. So what is responsible sourcing? The adoption by multinationals, so we're focusing on multinationals, but in general, superstar firms, large firms, whatever is your favorite tag, they are increasingly adopting standards for the working conditions in firms that are their suppliers. These conditions can be uniquely about their direct suppliers or their entire value chain. But increasingly more, this is a prevalent practice by multinationals. The way that they're typically implemented is through suppliers' codes of conduct. So basically what these multinationals do is they create this code of conduct and then they share it with their suppliers and they say from now on, you're required to meet all these conditions. And if you don't, then the relationship would be discontinued. And the multinationals typically enforce, they audit these suppliers, making sure that they actually comply with what is written in the suppliers' codes of conduct. So what are these requirements about? They have to do with wage floors for the workers of the suppliers, the benefits that they receive. So think about maternity leave, sick leave, a maximum number of hours that workers are allowed to work, safety standards in the plant, whether they're allowed to unionize or not, etc. And what are the stated objectives of such RS codes of conduct? Typically, the way multinationals frame it is that they aim to homogenize conditions across countries where they operate, in the attempt to benefit the workers, particularly those in developing countries where their working conditions are more precarious. So with this background in mind, we ask, what is the actual impact that RS policies have on the ground? And we're first asking the question, do they actually have teeth? Do they actually have an effect? And if they do, what are these effects? And we're going to ask this question both in a reduced form way, but also we're going to be guided by a general equilibrium model to actually provide evidence on the more general equilibrium implications of RS policies. So what does this paper do? So first, we develop a quantitative GE model that allows us to think through the incidence of RS. We will, with the help of this model, we will derive comparative statics that will allow us to rationalize the observed effects and understand in which version of the world we live in. So for instance, do we live in a world with competitive labor markets or monopsonistic labor markets? And moreover, this model will allow us to derive expressions for the welfare effects in GE, the welfare effects of RS rollouts. RS is, again, responsible sourcing, both on average, but also by worker type. So we will separate workers as high skill, low skill. Then we will provide new evidence on the effects of RS rollouts on firms and workers. Here, the new data set that will be sort of pivotal to our ability to study the effects of RS rollouts will cover the largest 481 multinationals with subsidiaries in Costa Rica. And for these ones, we've done a comprehensive search of what are the RS rollouts that they have done since 2009. And we have found that 135 of them, they have rolled out an RS code. You might ask yourself, well, what is the footprint of these RS codes? Should we expect G effects from them? Well, I'm just going to give you a soundbite, one descriptive statistic, which is that by 2019, the last year of our empirical analysis, 38% of the domestic production of Costa Rica is under the umbrella of a firm that is under an active RS code. So it's not peanuts. In a small open economy where FDI is important, it's to be expected that these RS codes would have potentially G implications. And this data set, we will combine it with other data sets that we have constructed for previous work, namely the firm-to-firm transactions data, managed employer-employee, etc. And with these data sets together, we're going to implement event studies that allow us to look at the firm level, at the worker level, and at the transaction level. What are the effects of these RS rollouts? And then in the quantitative part, the quantitative G part, we're going to combine the model that we've developed in the first stage with our data to do counterfactual analysis and to study the G effects of RS on the welfare of workers in a sourcing country. And in our empirical setup, this sourcing country is Costa Rica. So let me give you a preview of findings in case you need to sort of zoom out for various reasons. So first, in terms of the theory, we're going to see that the welfare incidence of RS policies in sourcing origin countries is ex ante ambiguous. So what are the main two forces that drive the effect in one direction or another? So in terms of a positive push, a positive welfare effect, we have the fact that most of these multinationals that roll out RS policies, they're actually export oriented. So when they roll out these RS policies, they increase the labor costs in their supply chain, but this increase in the labor cost is actually passed over to foreign consumers. So what this does is this allows, so basically this has an export tax effect because of this increase being borne by foreign consumers. And then on the negative side, we will see that to the extent that the domestic firms in the supply chain of a multinational also have, one second, so to the extent that these domestic firms, they also sell to the domestic economy, so they're not entirely focused on only supplying to multinationals, then there's a leakage of these RS policies to the local consumers, and this increases the domestic price index. And this has a negative effect on welfare. Yes, Chenzi, please.
Yeah, I just had a clarifying question. So
yes,
on this mechanism of the export tax, that suggests that these multinationals are exporting something quite non-substitutable. And therefore, they're not the ones who are bearing the incidence. So is this an assumption or is that actually an empirical result?
So we are going to have several, so just to make sure I understand your question. So we're going to allow several things to happen. First, we're going to allow for the pass-through of the cost increase to the multinational to not be perfect, to not be one-to-one. So we're actually going to estimate what the pass-through of the cost increase from the supplier to the multinational is. So that's a first thing that I wanted to clarify. It's not something that we impose, it's something that we will estimate. What is the pass-through? And then in terms of what happens between the multinational and its own customers, we're going to have in the model the possibility that the rollout of an RS policy is something that is profit maximizing. In which sense? In the sense that when the multinational, the more generous a multinational is in its RS code, the more this will increase the demand for its goods. So if Western consumers are have a taste for responsibly sourced cornflakes or whatever other good, then this is something that we will allow for. Again, it's something that we will estimate. It's not something that we're imposing. It could be that we don't find that there's a demand effect of RS policies for multinationals, but it's something that we, it's a finding. It's not something that we impose onto the model. Thank you for the question. Okay, so in terms of the empirics, what do we find? We find that RS policies are not just hot air. So from the event study analysis, we see that 4 years after a rollout by a multinational, its suppliers that are exposed to the policy, and we define exposure as selling to that multinational in the year before the multinational rolls out the policy. So for instance, if the multinational rolls out in 2013, the exposed suppliers that I'm describing here are all those firms selling to that multinational in 2012. So it's like an intent to treat type of definition. And for these exposed suppliers, we find on average that there's a significant reduction in their sales and also in their employment. So they are shrinking in size. And as we will see later, this can come both from the intensive margin in their relationship with a multinational, but also from the extensive margin from dropping from the relationship with a multinational. Then in terms of what happens to the workers, the continuing workers in these firms, for them, there is an increase in wages, particularly so for the low wage workers. So these are the ones for whom you would expect that these policies have most of a bite, because those are the ones that are closest to the minimum wage, whose working conditions are most precarious. As you would expect, because the low wage workers are becoming relatively more expensive relative to the high skilled workers, we're seeing that these firms are substituting away from low wage workers towards high wage workers. So these firms are becoming more skill intensive. Yes, Chancy, please.
Are you also able to look at capital investment and see if that sort of labor substitution happens with capital intensity?
Yeah, it's a great question. Right now, in this version of the model, we don't have it. We have only workers, the two types of workers as factors of production for the domestic firms. In the final version of the model, we're also going to have capital as an input for production. And there we will bring in the balance sheet data. For sort of the sake of cleanliness, at this stage, we only focused on labor as these are the inputs that are explicitly targeted by the RS policies. But of course, there could also be these firms becoming more capital intensive for sure. Great. And then in terms of the quantification, we find that RS has led to welfare gains but only for a very specific category, namely for those workers that were exposed to the policy and that were low wage workers. Everyone else is losing. So for the majority of the low wage workers, they actually experience a decline in welfare. This is driven by two forces. The first force is the fact that as low wage workers are becoming relatively more expensive, there's a fall in the relative demand for low wage workers. So this is one way in which the nominal wages are falling for the non-exposed low wage workers. And moreover, because there's this leakage of the RS policy into the domestic economy. So the suppliers to multinationals, they also supply to domestic firms. This increases the domestic price index, and this is another force through which RS is hurting the low-wage workers that are non-exposed in the definition that I gave before. This will be clearer later when you see the model. So given that it's only a 1-hour presentation, I will skip over the literature review slide, but of course there's a literature out there on FDI, on RS programs, on fair trade, and on corporate social responsibility that we want to acknowledge. Okay, so let me quickly start with the model. So we have, this is the baseline simplistic version of the model in which we make several simplifications for exposition, but the version that is the one that we actually take to the calibration and all that is, of course, has more bells and whistles. But let me focus on the baseline version. So the baseline version has 2 countries. Home would be in the empirical setting, Costa Rica. Foreign is everyone else. For preferences are CES, unsurprisingly, where D omega is the demand shifter for any variety indexed by omega. We have 2 types of workers, initially low wage and initially high wage. We define who's low wage and high wage depending on what is the initial wage that they have when they appear in the matched employer-employee data. We could have also built a measure of low skill, high skill. They would have basically overlapped. So that's just one empirical choice. So think of them as low skill, high skill, or low wage, high wage workers. We allow them to both contribute to production but by being imperfect substitutes. Rho is the elasticity of substitution, which we will estimate. Yes, Kerem.
The preferences are the same in Costa Rica and the rest of the world?
Right now, yes.
Because, I mean, the obvious thing I would think of is that US has a higher, this kind of a luxury good, right? That the US has a higher preference for responsible sourcing than a developing country.
So the way that we're integrating that now is not directly basically now it's this demand shifter that only activates for foreign consumers and does not activate for domestic consumers. But that's the only way in which we're right now incorporating the fact that it's the foreign consumers that potentially have a taste for RS policies.
Okay, like to clarify, yes. D omega is 1 for all varieties in Costa Rica.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. So yeah, inelastic labor supply of each type, and the income is the labor income plus a transfer of the domestic firm profits, and the transfer is proportional to the wage. Now, moving to the production, we have the final good that can be produced by 2 types of firms. There are the domestic firms, the non-M&E firms. They're heterogeneous in productivity. This productivity is distributed Pareto with the shape parameter theta. And in this version of the model, going to Shenzi's comment, they only use labor to produce, the 2 types of labor. So right now we don't have capital in this version of the production function, being the one that we've seen on the previous page, previous slide. And now in terms of the multinationals, the foreign multinationals, they're indexed by X. Right now we're assuming them to be homogeneous, and to produce, they combine labor, again, the 2 types of labor, and the intermediate inputs that are produced by home firms. And then going back to the domestic firms, again, they're heterogeneous in productivity, and they can produce both for the final domestic market, and they can produce for the M&E market as an input for the M&Es. They have to pay a fixed cost to enter in any of them in each of the 2 markets. And we assume that the fixed costs are such that only the more productive firms in Costa Rica can select into the M&E market. And once they've paid the fixed costs for each of the two markets, firms, they produce with a constant marginal cost. Then we assume that both home firms and multinational subsidiaries, they can either sell domestically or export. And if you export subject to a fixed cost. And in the baseline model, baseline version of the model, we have monopolistic competition in each of the markets. Now, how do we introduce the RS policies? So the RS policies are basically an increase in the labor costs of the firms that supply to multinationals. And we make two assumptions here that are in line with both what we find in the empirical side and also what we learned about how RS policies are being implemented in the real world. So first, the first assumption that we make is that these RS policies are binding for the low-wage workers, but they're not binding for the high-wage workers. So they're binding for the cleaning lady in a firm, they're not binding for the engineer in the firm. That's, an assumption. You can also interpret the effects on the high-wage workers as, what they are. You will see that because we're making this assumption that the RS policies are not binding for the high-wage workers, we're going to read into what happens to the wage of the high-wage workers as saying something about whether there is an improvement in productivity that comes from RS or not. So yes, Chenzi.
This is just more of a clarifying question about the context. One thing we see in the US is that more low skill types of jobs are being taken out of the firm and outsourced completely. Yes. Is that something that you see in the Costa Rica setting?
So that's not something that we study directly, like how much of this is outsourcing or not. But of course, there is an increasing trend that, and this is not just specific for multinationals, that industries such as the cleaning services industry or security services, catering services are these sectors are exploding, and we think that they're exploding not because there's an exploding demand for them, but because these were services that were before done within the boundary of the firm, and now firms are focusing more on their core activity and outsourcing and these firms, and then having them as suppliers instead of a unit within the firm. Here, we're thinking about arm's length relationships. So these are firms that are a different tax ID, like the suppliers are not units within the firm, within the multinational, are a separate firm. And they were a separate firm even before the RS policy was implemented. So the way we define the exposure, these are firms that were selling in the year before the RS rollout. So it's not something that the multinational has done as a reaction to the RS policy, that now it has decided to outsource a given service or good. But yes, it's for sure it's a phenomenon that is not specific just to the US. Thank you. Okay, and the second important assumption is that these RS conditions have to apply to the entire production of that firm, and not just to the production line that goes to the multinational. And this is in line with many discussions with multinationals, with suppliers, with Laura Brudro, with many people like specialists on these topics, basically saying that the multinational wants the entire firm to treat well its workers, not just, the floor where they produce for that specific multinational. There might be some empirical concerns as to whether firms are splitting into several tax IDs. This is something that we actually checked in the data. So we looked whether suppliers exposed to the policy are more likely to break into several tax IDs. So if their workers are moving in chunks into different tax IDs, and we don't find evidence of that being the case. So we don't think that there's this trick being used by firms to avoid the leakage of the RS policy onto its domestic production line. So in theory, yes, Kerem.
So some RS policies are per worker and can be represented as a tax. Some are fixed cost, right? Like to make sure that there are safety standards against fire and whatnot. So that may be inducing a different kind of selection, may have different welfare consequences. If you see in your the documents that you are reading in the rollout would be additionally separately interesting evidence to tease out what is a wage effect and what is a fixed cost effect. Yes,
that's an important point. Right now, we have it as a variable cost increase. We're working also on a version of the model that in which it's a fixed cost only. I don't think we have it. Yeah, we haven't done it yet in which it's both a fixed cost and a variable cost increase. Just to give still under the assumption that this is a variable cost increase, when we actually go and estimate what this tau is, what this increase in the variable cost is, we're not going to estimate it based on what is happening to wages, but we're going to basically backward engineer it. We're going to estimate it based on what happens to the sales of firms. So and that is acknowledging that these RS policies go above and beyond wages. There are many other costs that they're increasing for the firm. We're just assuming that these costs are, per worker as opposed to fixed, but we're not estimating them from what happens to wages. Okay, I will have to speed up, I think. I'm a bit slow. So, okay, so what are the alternative hypotheses about RS that our model allows for? What is the motivation of the from the perspective of the multinational for the RS policy? So I mentioned this before, we allow for there to be a shift in demand for the multinational. So the higher the tau, the better the demand shock they receive. We allow for RS to be accompanied by also a productivity gain for suppliers. So if workers at suppliers are just becoming more productive because they like to work in a more safe environment, this is something that we allow for and we estimate. We allow for there to be an imperfect pass-through of the cost increase from the supplier to the multinational, and we capture that via reduced form pass-through parameter beta. And we also allow for the labor market in the sourcing country, in Costa Rica in the empirical context, to not be perfectly competitive, but to be monopsonistic. So that's also something that we allow for. So then when we go to the comparative statics, what do we actually do? We're going to compare the effects of a small change coming from RS on the sales of the exposed suppliers versus the sales of suppliers to other MNEs that never roll out an RS policy that are part of the control group. So you might be concerned that, if we were comparing with firms that are not suppliers to multinationals in general, then these are just different firms. So that's a choice that we're making to sort of keep the control group as comparable as possible, with the exception that they're not exposed to an RS policy. And again, the exposed suppliers are the ones that were selling to that MNE that rolls out an RS policy in the year before the event. So they were above an initial productivity cutoff. And once of course, this productivity cutoff will change once the RS policy will be implemented, namely it will increase. So this exposed group of suppliers, they contain two types of firms. They include firms that remain in the relationship with a multinational, and we call those compliers. So those firms are affected by the RS policy on the intensive margin, but they also contain firms that exit the relationship with that multinational, and that's the extensive margin. So when we look at the effects on the sales of exposed firms, you should have in the background of your mind that we're going to put together both the intensive margin and the extensive margin. Okay. So what is the summary of this comparative statics that we stared at when we were thinking about what is the world we live in? So we were looking at the sales of these firms to different groups of firms. So either the sales of the exposed firms to the multinational triggering the event, or sales to everyone else, to all its other buyers, or the total sales. All these three types of sales were for the exposed firms. And we were also looking at what was happening on the intensive margin to the sales, to the RS-MNE for the compliers, okay? And depending on which version of the world we were in the theory part, we had certain predictions on what should happen, what the sign should be for these different sales. So for instance, if we were in the case that the labor market in Costa Rica would have been monopsonistic, then we should have found an increase in the sales to other buyers for these exposed firms, and we should have found an increase in the sales to the MNE for the compliers. So because later on, when I get to the empirical results, I'm going to show you that there's no such increase. This will allow us to rule out that the labor market in Costa Rica is monopsonistic. And therefore, we will focus, when we go to the quantification of the model, on the version of the model where the labor market is competitive as opposed to monopsonistic. Okay, so that's how we use these comparative statics. And something that is quite neat, we think, though that's not a modest thing to say, is that the event studies that I'm going to show you in the next couple of minutes are actually tied to the comparative statics that I'm showing you in this table. So when you think about these signs, and then you look at the different event study coefficients that I'm going to show you, there's a mapping between the two. So when we have a minus or a plus here, it's already accounting for the fact that in the reduced form, when we compare the effects on the exposed suppliers to non-exposed suppliers, we're accounting away for, for basically controlling away for all the G effects that are at play from RS. Okay, so what are the welfare implications of RS? And that's the last theory slide before we actually go to the results. So there are three effects. Let me focus on the second and the third first, and then I will conclude with the more interesting one. So the one in the middle comes from the possibility that there might be a productivity increase. So typically productivity increases are good things. So if there is a productivity increase coming from RS, this is something that will be welfare enhancing. It will have a positive effect on welfare. Of course, whatever productivity effect we find, if we find any, it would have to be scaled down by the fraction of workers that are actually working in RS compliant producers. It's not a generalized economy-wide productivity increase. Then there is another positive effect that would come from the fact that there might be a foreign demand shock that is positive coming from RS, but again, this is kind of left out to estimation. Will we find a demand shock or not? Is RS demand increasing or not for the multinational? Now let's focus on the first term, which is the more interesting term, and that has to do with the fact that again, because most multinationals are export-oriented, this RS policy acts as an export tax on home exports. And of course, we will have to sort of attenuate or modulate what this effect is on welfare depending on what is the leakage. So for instance, the more we have that the domestic firms are actually selling to the domestic economy, so the higher the leakage is, the more this will act against the terms of trade effect. So high leakage is a bad thing, is something that eats out from this export tax effect. And then on the other hand, we have the pass-through, so the beta. So the lower the beta is, the lower the pass-through is to the foreign prices, the more, again, this will reduce the terms of trade effect. So to have a strong export tax effect, we would want a high pass-through of the cost increase to foreign prices, and we would want a low leakage of these RS policies to the domestic economy. Okay, so overall, there's an ambiguous sign of this welfare effect of tau, given this comparison that we need to make between what beta and delta is. So now let me quickly talk to you about the data. So in case you've seen other presentations of mine or José's, so basically the main 5 administrative data sets from Costa Rica that we put together include the firm-to-firm transaction data, so all formal supplying relationships in the country above what is a rather small threshold, given that we care about relationships with multinationals. The matched temporary employee data, from where we get the labor earnings, we know who works for whom, we can define who the exposed workers are. The corporate income tax returns, so we use here the total sales, the employment, but going to Chenzi's point, we would also use assets as a proxy for capital. The custom records, we need to know who's an exporter, who's an importer, and of course, we need to know who's a multinational or not. And on top of that, we constructed 2 other non-Costa Rican data sets that we link to the M&E subsidiaries in Costa Rica. One of them is the Orbis data that tracks what happens to the overall size of these multinational groups. And what happens to the overall size of the multinational group will be one of the important moments that we will use to estimate whether there's a demand effect or not of RS. Okay, so this is an important moment that we will bring in. And for identification and interpretation, we need to know what drives these RS policies. And in particular, one concern that you might have is that RS policies are coming as a result of some negative events for the multinational. And if that was the case, then looking at what happens at the overall size of the multinational might be a bit misleading, because we would be conflating the negative effect that was actually driving the rollout of the RS policy with the effect of the RS policy itself. So to assuage this concern, Pamina Koenig and her co-authors have been very generous to share the SIGWACH data with us, and this has allowed us to see that actually RS policies are not driven by previous negative events happening to that multinational, as proxied by global NGO campaigns against that multinational. And then the new data set that we construct, as I was mentioning in the intro, we focus on the largest 481 multinationals in Costa Rica. The way we have selected them, these are all the M&E subsidiaries whose average yearly local purchases are larger than $1 million. They account for most of the activity of foreign-owned firms in Costa Rica, so you shouldn't be concerned that we're having a small glimpse of foreign ownership in the country. And what we did is to implement a comprehensive search of the RS reforms that these M&Es have undergone since 2009. And we found that there were 165 RS policy rollouts among 135 of these multinationals in the country. And one important detail, or not a detail, but aspect of these RS policy rollouts is that they were 85% of them were implemented globally by the multinational. So it's something that the headquarters said, we need to do this, and we need to do this everywhere in the world where we source from. So it's not something that is specific to Costa Rica, that the subsidiary in Costa Rica decided to roll out because of some Costa Rica specific trends that they might have noticed. So this is something that we will be using in our empirical strategy. So very quickly, some descriptive stats. I'll go fast through them so that I can finish the slides. Basically, multinationals are very large firms, 40% of them from the US, 25% of them from Western Europe. a third of them in manufacturing, and everyone else between services, retail, and agriculture. These are multinationals you have heard of, the vast majority of them. And then in terms of the Costa Rican firms, they're an order of magnitude smaller than the multinational itself, of course, and significantly less active in manufacturing and much more in services and retail. And this reflects the fact that multinationals tend to import most of their core inputs and are supplied locally, for rather secondary inputs. And an important statistic that I mentioned in the intro is that, and important when you think about the G implications of RS, is that the share of total output from Costa Rican firms that is under the umbrella of an active RS code has more than doubled between 2009 and 2019, up to 38%. And this reflects both that there's more entry of multinationals in the country, but also the fact that there's more and more rollouts of RS with time. So in terms of what RS codes of conduct are about, they're about safety, about minimum wages. These words that we put here are just part of a bigger cloud of words that we've put together. And in terms of the background on Costa Rica, because you might not be as familiar with the country, you might think, oh, well, maybe Costa Rica to begin with was a country that had very strong laws, labor laws, and those labor laws were already being enforced by firms. And here what we're showing you is that it's just one example, that the law related to the minimum wage. More than a third of workers in Costa Rica are actually not even paid the legal minimum wage. So you shouldn't think of, so first, multinationals in these RS codes of conduct, they ask firms to go above and beyond the legal framework in the country. But even if they just require, even if they were to just require respecting the legal framework in the country, in developing countries, there's still a lot of non-compliance with that legal framework. So just asking for that already would have a very important bite, particularly so for firms that were, not complying, which you would expect are smaller firms closer to informality, so on and so forth. So let me show you a little bit the empirical evidence. So again, this is, here we're documenting the partial equilibrium effects, and this maps one-to-one with the comparative statics that I've mentioned before. So here we're going to look at the effect of MNE RS rollouts on total sales, employment and relative employment, what happens to the salaries of different types of workers, to the sales of the suppliers, broken down by whether they go to the RS multinational, actually, the triggering multinational, or everyone else, and also what happens to the multinational itself. And again, this will be important to pin down what happens to its demand effect. So here we're doing quite standard event study analysis. On the left-hand side, we have, for the firm level analysis, we have outcomes at the level of the firm I, in industry S in year T. Alpha I is the firm fixed effect, so we compare within firms. Then any effect, any shock that affects all firms in a given industry and year, we control for that with sector year fixed effects. And basically, the coefficients that we care about are the beta coefficients, the one that have to do with the event. And then the event is defined as being exposed to an RS policy, and the exposure, again, is defined on whether you were selling to that MNE in the year before the multinational rolls out the RS policy. Okay, so this is how we define exposure. There are a bunch of concerns with diff and diffs, staggered diff and diffs, event studies that we are well aware of. The work of Goodman Banken, Abraham and Sam, Borusiak, we actually implement these different robustness checks to make sure that our results are robust. You might be concerned that there is non-random treatment assignment. That's why we limit the sample to only Costa Rican firms that are actually suppliers to an MNE. And moreover, we instrument the RS events using the global rollouts by the MNE. So here we're using the fact that most of these rollouts are global rollouts. And yeah, a bunch of other robustness checks, but I will have to speed up a bit. And then we also do the event study analysis at the worker level and at the transaction level. So the only thing that is main thing that is important here to note is that when we do the analysis at the worker level, we have worker by firm fixed effect. So we are comparing within a worker firm relationship. So when I tell you about what happens to wages, these are for continuing workers in those firms. This is not just an effect coming from changes in composition of the firm, okay? It's for the same worker that was exposed to the policy and that remained with the firm. And at the transaction level, when we do the intensive margin analysis, we have buyer-supplier fixed effect. So what this means is that we focus within a relationship between a multinational and its suppliers, what happens to the transactions between the two. That's the intensive margin. So now let me show you results. Here, these are regressions at the supplier level for exposed suppliers. And what we have on the left-hand side is what happens to the total sales of the firm. And what we have on the right-hand side is what happens to its total employment. And two things to notice. First, that firms that are exposed to an RS rollout do not seem to be anticipating the rollout or selected in some relevant way. That's what we're reading from the fact that the coefficients before are not statistically significant. And after the RS rollout, we see a decrease in the size of the firm, both as measured in total sales and in terms of employment. And again, these are exposed firms. So here we have both the extensive and the intensive margin together. Now, what is this driven by? What kind of firms are driving this effect? So on the left-hand side, we split firms between their initial size or median size, however you want to define it. And on the right-hand side, whether they're in services or not. And what we're finding is that most of the effect of the decrease of the firms that are taking most of the hit of these RS rollouts are actually the small firms and the firms in services. So basically what this is saying is that these were the firms that were farthest away. That's the way how we're interpreting this finding, that they were the farthest away from the what the standard of the multinational was. So for them, it was most penalizing to be exposed to these RS rollouts. And that makes sense. It's typically the small firms in industries that are less regulated that were the ones not paying the minimum wage, not respecting all other labor laws, not treating well their workers. Moreover, here we do the split by the characteristics of the multinational, either by the GDP per capita of the headquarter country or the management score of firms in the headquarter country. We have a bunch of others having to do with how adverse to inequality the country is, the headquarter country, or how strict its own labor laws are. And basically the results are driven by multinationals coming from headquarter countries that are richer, with better managed firms, with more strict labor regulations, more adverse to inequality. So the kind of countries that you would have expected would have stricter RS codes of conduct, and also that they would put more resources to enforce those codes of conduct. Now, what about what is happening to workers? So on the left-hand side, we have all workers. Let's focus on the right-hand side for brevity. Here, we're splitting workers in 3 categories, depending on their initial wage when they first appear in the matched employer-employee data. So we have workers that are in the top quartile, middle 2 quartiles, or the bottom quartile. And what we see is that the positive effect on wages is driven by basically the bottom quartile workers. So those that were closest to the minimum wage, those that were in the most precarious working conditions, are the ones for whom these RS policies have a bite. And then for those that are in the top quartile, you know, the manager of the firm, the engineer of the firm, the accountant of the firm, they actually don't see any effect from the rollout of the RS policy. Now, this is what happens to the relative employment of low versus high wage workers. And this just reflects the fact that low wage workers become relatively more expensive relative to high wage workers. This moment will be important when we estimate the elasticity of substitution between the 2 worker types. Now here I'm showing you what happens to the sales of the multinational of the supplier to the RS-MNE itself. On the left-hand side, we're putting together the intensive and extensive margin. On the right-hand side, we focus just on the intensive margin. And what we see is that there is clearly a fall in the overall sales to the RS-MNE. And most of it is driven by the extensive margin, rupture of relationships, though we find some negative effect also on the intensive margin. But it's very much driven by what happens in event year 4. So it depends how you want to interpret that particular finding. Okay. Now, what about everyone else? What happens in the sales that these firms have to everyone else? Well, there's a fall in the sales to everyone else. And that's another moment, if you remember our comparative statics table, that will be crucial for us, both for knowing in which version of the world we're in. So for instance, we're not in the monopsonistic version of the world, but also for parameter estimation. And last, here we're looking at what happens to the overall multinational. On the left-hand side, the multinational itself, the one that rolled out the RS policy. And on the left-hand side, we're looking at the subsidiary in Costa Rica of that multinational. On the right-hand side, we look at the overall size of the multinational as measured with the Orbis data. And what we find is that not much is going on to the overall size of the multinational. And remember, there are all these opposing forces. Maybe it's receiving a demand shock, but also it's receiving an increase in the input costs. And of course, what is happening to the overall size of the multinational will be another moment that we will use to estimate the different parameters. So now let me, in the last 5 minutes that I have, talk to you a little bit about parameter estimation and the G effects, the welfare effects. So we need a bunch of parameters. We need to know what is the size of the actual RS-induced cost increase. We need to know whether there's any increase in the in productivity. We need to know what is the pass-through, the beta of the cost increase from the supplier to the multinational. We need to estimate the shape parameter of the Costa Rican productivity distribution. Then we need to know whether there's any change in the MNE output demand due to the RS announcement. And we also need the elasticity of substitution in production between worker types. And right now, we're taking the elasticity of substitution that firms face in their output demand. We don't estimate it in this paper. We take it from a previous papers of ours, also from Costa Rica. So quickly on the model, on the parameter estimation. So what are the moments that we use? So we have 4 types of sales. We have the compliers sales to the RS-MNE, that's the intensive margin. We have the domestic sales of the exposed suppliers, something that I showed you 2 slides ago. We have the total sales of the exposed suppliers, and we have the sales of the RS-MNE. And in here, we have 4 parameters that we need to estimate. The RS policy, the shape parameter of the productivity distribution, the pass-through, and the demand shock. And with these four moments, these four types of sales, we can estimate these four parameters. And what we find is that the tau is 11%, so the increase in the labor cost is 11%. Note that this is higher than the increase that we had found for wages. So of course, RS policies go above and beyond just increases in wages. We find that the pass-through is 86%, and we find a very small, almost zero demand effect coming from the RS policy. And there are two other moments that we need to estimate, two other parameters that we need to estimate. One is whether there's an increase in productivity or not. And the way that we're estimating it is by looking at what happens to the wages of the high wage workers. Remember that we have assumed in the model that the RS policy is not binding for high wage workers. So if there's something that happens to the wages of the high wage workers in exposed firms versus non-exposed firms, then we interpret that as coming from a direct productivity effect of RS policy. And because, if you remember, we found a flat line for the high wage workers, we interpret that there is no productivity gain from RS itself. And then the elasticity of substitution between the two worker types, we estimated by looking at what happens to the relative employment of low versus high skill workers. And there are some other moments that we need, but let me just conclude with this slide. So yeah, basically here we do the counterfactual analysis, and we want to know what are the changes from an equilibrium without RS to one with RS, the one that we observe in Costa Rica by the end of the sample in 2019. And these are our estimates. So here we break the welfare effects by worker category. So here in the first line, we have the exposed low wage workers. Then the second bar is the non-exposed low wage workers. And then here we have the all high wage workers. And basically what we see is that the very small positive welfare effect from RS is entirely driven by the very strong positive effect on the welfare of the exposed low-wage workers. So these are the workers that are basically directly targeted by the RS policies, right? So those are the firms, they are working at the firms that are supplying to the multinational rolling out the RS policy, and the policy is most binding for them because they are the ones who are not even paid the minimum wage, who are not getting paid maternity leave, sick leave, who, basically have the most precarious work conditions. And as I was mentioning in the introduction, however, the non-exposed low-wage workers are negatively affected. And they're more than 80% of the entire workforce in terms of low-wage workers. And they're negatively affected by two forces, the fall in their relative demand, and also by the fact that there's this leakage of the RS policies into the domestic economy. And because of this leakage, there's an increase in the domestic price index, their real wages are going down. The high wage workers are getting a very small positive effect. This is driven by the fact that the relative increase in the demand for high wage workers is barely overcoming the negative effect on the domestic price index. So that's why we have a positive effect, but a small positive effect because we have this other force working against it. So on net, we find a very small positive welfare gain, but again, it's entirely driven by the exposed low wage workers. So let me conclude. There is an increasingly widespread adoption of RS policies by multinationals. This is driven by themselves, their own initiative. There's also a lot of organisms and governments that are pushing for RS policies, ILO, OECD, the German government, etc. So this is big. And we basically ask, what are the effects? Are there any effects and what are they? And we find that no, RS is not just hot air. We do find effects of RS policy rollouts. In the theory, before we actually went to our empirical application, we didn't know whether it's going to be positive or negative. And we found that in our empirical context, there are positive effects, but very small in the aggregate and only driven by the exposed low-wage workers. Thank you so much for your comments and for taking an hour of your time.
Thanks, Isabela. And I invite everyone to stay a few more minutes if Isabela has time. I will do so.
I have time, but I won't take it personally if everyone else disappears. But I'm happy to stay along.
Yeah, no, I didn't want to interrupt you after a certain point in the presentations, but we will otherwise, we'll conclude July 18 in 2 weeks with Laura Ogliari, who will talk about power mismatch and civil conflict. Yeah, so I'll stay. I have a few questions.
Please.
But otherwise, bye everyone. So, Isabela, one thing you mentioned when you were giving some summary statistics about suppliers, but you didn't show any results with respect to heterogeneous effects by industry affiliation of suppliers, whether they are. I
showed services versus non-services.
Did you? Okay.
Yeah, and most of the effects were driven by suppliers in services.
In services, okay. I mean, they should be the ones, right? So I missed that. Sorry. They must be the ones that have the highest elasticity of substitution. They're like maybe janitorial services, as you alluded to, cleaning, whatnot. And I don't know what the firm does if it has this aggregate effect of reduced sales. I mean, maybe they substitute towards capital, as it was suggested. Maybe they just put up with less clean services, or they put coffee machines instead of a cafeteria. But if it is manufacturing and you don't find a big effect on manufacturing, then there must be some other compensation, some bargaining between the supplier and the firm is making up for that, or the firm is substituting towards other inputs supplied from its home country, right? It would be interesting to dig further into what's happening there.
Yes, I think it's an important point. The way we were interpreting it, but I think you're bringing some important alternative explanations that we should entertain. The way we were interpreting it was more about firms. Okay. Yeah, how labor conditions looked in different types of firms at the get-go. So kind of the way we were thinking about it is, when you're thinking about developing countries, informality, tax evasion, low compliance, we typically think about small firms and firms in industries where it's kind of easier to hide income. So services, would be a easy way, because you don't have customs data, you don't have.
You fall under the radar.
Yeah, they're more likely to fall under the radar. And then you have multinationals coming in and saying, well, if you want to continue working with us, then there are all these things that you need to start doing, which in many cases go above and beyond even what the local government is asking, and already they're not complying with what the local government is asking. So there are two steps. It's first, they need to comply with what the local government is asking, which, as I was saying in the 30 seconds that I devoted to the context about Costa Rica, there's very low compliance, even conditional on GDP per capita. If you think about Costa Rica, you would think there's more compliance than there actually is. And so there's that. And then moreover, multinationals ask for other standards that are above and beyond what the Costa Rican government is asking for in the way we treat workers. So that's the way we were interpreting it. But you're right in saying that maybe it's also about how easy it is to substitute away from a firm that is not complying. Maybe if that firm is supplying secondary input, then it's easier to substitute away and look for another firm that is already complying, versus in manufacturing, maybe if the firm is supplying a core input, then yeah, I can see how that's also an important alternative explanation for that finding.
With respect to identification, I mean, you are right that these are global. That's obvious. It's not driven by Costa Rican concerns, but there's one potential issue about the MNEs that institute these versus those who do not, because that's the key variation you are exploiting, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are they responding to some incidents in their industries? You do have industry year fixed effects. I guess that's maybe picking it up to some extent.
So we have industry by time fixed effects in the supplier regressions, and that's the industry of the supplier, not the industry of
not
the
of the multinational. Okay.
We have another set of regressions which are at the multinational level. And in those ones, we had several versions of those regressions just to see, how robust our findings were. And fortunately they were, but I remember in one of the specifications, we were running industry by time, where the fixed effects, where the industry was the industry of the headquarter, was the industry of the multinational.
Right. The concern is that they are anticipating some issues, some attention to that industry, like a scandal comes out in Nike and then all apparel producers rush into it.
Yeah, so we haven't yet done like a formal analysis of whether they're correlated in timing across industries of the multinational. The way we're thinking about it is they're multinationals that at different points in time, for whatever internal reason, they think now is the time. What we were concerned about were two things. First, we were concerned about there being a particular negative event affecting that particular multinational. So for instance, Rana Plaza happens to you as a multinational, and then the next year you roll out an RS policy. And then we look at what happens to the overall sales of the multinationals, and we're reading a lot into it, right? We have all that structure. We estimate parameters out of it, but we're not, Rana Plaza is not in there. So then that's where the data of Pamina Koenig and her co-authors comes in to allow us to look at the campaigns against multinationals in the years prior to the RS rollout to see whether there was any anticipatory, whether there was something going on prior to that for those particular multinationals.
And the answer was negative?
The answer was negative. Something else that we are doing, we haven't yet run the regressions, but we have just gathered the data, is we've gathered Bordex data, and Bordex data is telling us what have been all the changes in executive management in multinationals across time, and we've linked the IDs of the identity of the multinationals that we study in Costa Rica, both treated and non-treated, with the Bordex data. And we want to run regressions in which we look whether there were any changes in management of that multinational at the same time or just before the RS rollout, because then again, there's this idea that we're looking at the outcome of the multinational worldwide or in Costa Rica, reading a lot into it as being caused by the RS policy, but maybe the RS policy itself was
part of a new restructuring.
Yeah, by some CEO restructuring or something. So we haven't yet run those regressions, but it's in the pipeline of things that we want to do to think of, because from the perspective of the supplier itself, yes, the shock is unexpected, we think, but the concern that you're raising is, okay, you also care about what happens to the multinational. And for the multinational, can we think of the event as being exogenous?
Yeah, I think that's totally the clear, right, kind of division you exploit.
Yes.
Anything you can do to address issues there about sort of heterogeneity or selection?
Yes, yes, yes.
into instituting these reforms would support your cause.
Thank you.
Cool.
Yes, yes.
I guess one final thing, whether these are tradable or not, what the multinational does is tradable or not, doesn't matter, because like say if it is Kentucky Fried Chicken, it still is worried about sort of a reputational spillover from like its supplier in Costa Rica being exposed by an NGO to its image, right, as a PR thing, in some sense, like not just PR, but it's basically a negative spillover to its reputation. It doesn't have to be a product that they're exporting back to the developed country.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where your comment steps in, because the way that we are, you know, the multinational being profit maximizing, the way we're introducing it is by having this D for the foreign market. So in that sense, if the multinational does not export at all, there's no taste of the local consumers for RS.
I mean, in that case, maybe the way to capture this whole story and preferences, I mean, kind of another way that people typically think is that there's a probability of a scandal of an NGO exposing you, or you're not even aware how bad things are at your suppliers. That comes to light, and then your sales suffer everywhere. It could be not because you have a tradable good, it's just your image as a corporation is tainted, and people stop going to Kentucky Fried Chicken because its operations in Costa Rica are terrible.
So
then it's like a probability combined with sales dropping. Basically, what you do is like preventing that downside.
Yeah, I think so. It's more semantic than anything. But before we were saying either that the multinational is profit maximizing if we found like a big D effect, or it's altruistic if we did not. And people were very uncomfortable with the word altruistic because they just do not think that multinationals can be altruistic. Or that their CEO can be altruistic. I mean, we borrowed the terminology from the Tirol et al., CSR work, but let's say we don't like that way of phrasing things. The way people like more the phrasing is, it's not profit maximizing in the short run, or it's something that you do, and this is exactly what you're saying, that it's still profit maximizing
in the long run,
but it's in the long run. You have these tail events, and you just want to insure yourself against tail events. And that's why they would.
I don't know if these two are isomorphic in the way the preferences
I mean,
are.
our analysis allows us to see up to 4 years after the event, so it's kind of short run. It's a Rana Plaza doesn't happen every year, or a big oil spill in the Mexican Gulf, or so these are events that most likely we would not observe in the time frame of our analysis.
Good stuff.
Thank you, Kerem, and thank you for holding the fort for this presentation.
4th of July. Yep.
Oh yeah, it's 4th of July. True. Okay. Even more. Thank you so much, and I'll let you go back to the hot dogs or whatever if you're celebrating. Really nice catching up. Thank you so much for organizing this. Bye bye.